You think Star Trek's transporter is a marvel of science fiction? In reality, it was born simply because the production crew ran out of money for a landing sequence. Spock's initial design nearly got the entire project canceled on day one, and in a history-making kissing scene. The actors intentionally sabotaged every backup take to force the network's hand. Forget the polished behind-the-scenes featurettes. These are 15 dark truths behind the sci-fi series that defined a generation, and none of them are what you've been led to believe. 1. The transporter machine and a network's empty wallet. The teleportation technology wasn't a brilliant, visionary glimpse into the future. It was the desperate solution to an empty wallet. Mid-1960s at Desilu Studios. The air in the writer's room is thick with the stench of cheap cigarette smoke, the soulless clacking of mechanical typewriters, and the heavy sighs exhaled from the accounting department. Gene Roddenberry is nursing a colossal ambition to propel humanity into the depths of deep space. In the earliest drafts, the script demanded that the Starship Enterprise slowly touch down on the surfaces of alien planets every single week. But to materialize just a few dozen seconds of a landing sequence on film, the production team had to cast massive, heavy spacecraft models. They had to construct gigantic topographical dioramas out of plaster, stretch dozens of meters of cables, mobilize laborers to rig lighting systems for days on end, and execute exorbitant stop-motion photography. A single touchdown of the Enterprise would completely devour the production budget of an entire episode. The financial executives from the television network walked in. They glanced over the budget estimates, grimaced, and immediately slashed blindingly red ink across the script. The verdict was sharp and irreversible. There will be no landings. The money is gone. Backed into a corner, the crew faced an existential dilemma. They couldn't use small shuttlecrafts because they didn't even have the funds to build an auxiliary cockpit set. The script needed a shortcut, the cheapest, fastest one possible. It was from this absolute dead end that a lunatic solution sparked erase the actors on the ship and make them materialize down on the planet. No shuttles, no landings. The visual effects team immediately set to work with a budget hovering near absolute zero. They flipped a glass jar filled with water upside down and sprinkled glowing aluminum powder into it. A blinding backlight was blasted straight at the jar, and the camera began recording the eerie, slow-motion descent of the shimmering aluminum flakes suspended in the liquid. Later, in the editing room, this optical illusion was superimposed over the actors standing frozen on the soundstage. At a cold, piercing hum from the sound department, and the quantum transporter was officially born. A multi-million-dollar headache completely eradicated by a visual hallucination costing a few dozen cents. Millions of mainstream viewers in the 60s, and later the Gen Xers who grew up with VHS tapes, stared in mesmerized awe at their screens. They believed they were witnessing the absolute pinnacle of human futurity, but in a cruel twist of irony. They were simply staring at cheap aluminum powder floating in the water of a broke production crew. Decades later, Gene Roddenberry looked back at the past with a serene smile, gently dubbing this sleight of hand a case of creative pressure inadvertently producing a better result than planned. Extreme financial destitution inadvertently forged an iconic technology, but the franchise's most recognizable symbol came from an origin that not even its financial backers could have ever anticipated. 2. The Vulcan salute and its synagogue origins. Boston, the 1930s. An 8-year-old boy sits obediently next to his father on the wooden pews of an Orthodox synagogue. The air is heavy with the scent of aged oak and burning beeswax. Up on the bema, the Kohanim clerics begin to perform the priestly blessing under strict religious decree. Everyone must shut their eyes tight. No one is permitted to look directly at the presence of the divine. But a child's curiosity will always overpower fear. The boy sneaked a peek through his fingers. The sight before him instantly burned itself into his psyche. The clerics had their arms outstretched, their fingers split into the shape of the Hebrew letter Shin SH. Years later, Leonard Nimoy would still shudder when recalling that stolen glance, describing the moment as like a miracle. Fast forward to 1967. On the set of the episode Amok Time, the script required the character Spock to have a greeting ritual unique to the Vulcan race, rather than a mundane human handshake. Nimoy remembered that synagogue from his youth. He raised his hand, parting his fingers. The director nodded. Television history turned a page. For decades to follow, on schoolyards from America to Europe, millions of Gen X children raised their hands to greet one another. NASA astronauts performed it on the space station. American presidents flashed it before the media's lenses. Not a single one of them knew that, with every split of their fingers. They were repeating one of the most ancient and sacred blessings in Judaism. Religion had been perfectly camouflaged beneath the veneer of science fiction. Conversely, network executives were hypersensitive to any imagery that evoked the occult, leading to an emergency censorship mandate that nearly eradicated the show's most beloved character. 3. The looming death sentence on Spock's skin. Return to the foundational days of the project. Gene Roddenberry's storyboards described the alien science officer with chilling details, an angular face, pointed ears, and skin as blood-red as crimson. The makeup department enthusiastically slathered Leonard Nimoy's face in a thick layer of red grease paint. But the moment the test footage reached the NBC executive offices, pure panic detonated. The network suits slammed their hands on the table. This was the 1960s. Color television was a luxury item far beyond the reach of the vast majority of middle-class American families. Most viewers would be watching this program through a bulky black and white receiver sitting in the middle of their living rooms. Broadcasting a pointy-eared, red-skinned creature would conjure an optical disaster, filtered through black and white screens. That red paint would render as a murky, pitch-black gray, coupled with the pointed ears. Spock would look like nothing less than the literal incarnation of Satan crawling out of hell. NBC foresaw a violent wave of boycotts from conservative viewers in the American South. A censorship order came down like a guillotine. Red was absolutely forbidden. The makeup crew begrudgingly remixed their palettes, mutating Spock into an alien with a pale, yellowish-green complexion, a safer, far more washed-out hue. Leonard Nimoy himself once shrugged, acknowledging the technical reality. I would have looked like a black smudge on a black and white screen. Spock narrowly escaped a visual death sentence. However, a physical incident right on the set would leave an irreversible life sentence for those standing in front of the lens. 4. The eternal ringing in the crew's heads. Hollywood in the 60s wasn't as glamorous as it appeared on screen. It was a crude, industrial construction site. There were no green screens for protection, no digital sound effects safely inserted inside an air-conditioned studio. When the script called for an explosion, the prop department used live gunpowder. They stuffed it into metal canisters, buried them in the dirt, and lit the fuse mere steps away from the actors. The episode, Arena, Season 1. Captain Kirk must face off against the Gorn creature in a barren desert wasteland. The director yelled action. William Shatner lunged forward, right behind his back. An eardrum-shredding explosion erupted. Rock dust flew everywhere. The shockwave slammed directly into the actor's head. No ear protection of any kind was issued. When it was Leonard Nimoy's turn, he too was forced to stand dangerously close to another explosive charge in a later season's episode. The scene ended. The cameras stopped rolling, but the howling shriek in their ears never did. Both Shatner and Nimoy contracted permanent tinnitus. Their hearing was permanently destroyed by the very cheap practical effects the network used to hook viewers. They traded a piece of their bodies for a few seconds of cinematic tension. Years later, Shatner coldly confirmed this physical reality. Both of our ears are ringing, and it never ends. That piercing, cold frequency followed them home, crept into their sleep, and remained their companion until the very end of their days. The actors' physical bodies bore the brutal consequences of devices that actually exploded. Meanwhile, the most complex-looking clusters of machinery on the ship carried a cynical, hidden mockery from the production crew aimed squarely at the audience. 5. The GNDN pipes and the ultimate cover-up joke. On weekends, especially as the franchise crossed into the 80s with the Next Generation, the most dedicated viewers would dig out their VHS tapes. They would hit the pause button, ignoring the static tracking lines bleeding across the screen, just to strain their eyes and analyze the labyrinth of plumbing running along the ship's corridors. They paid special attention to the massive pipes prominently stamped with the letters GNDN. Theories exploded across primitive internet forums. Were they cooling plasma conduits, high-grade antimatter relay systems? Fans racked their brains trying to uncover the sci-fi significance of every single puzzle piece. The truth was a bucket of ice water from the set design team. GNDN simply stood for Goes Nowhere, Does Nothing. It was a studio inside joke, a meaningless label printed out and slapped directly onto hollow plastic tubes they had hastily cobbled together to fill the frame. With 4 simple letters, the post-production crew silently mocked the fans' obsessive hyperfixation on the plywood and plastic of the soundstage. They threw pure nothingness right into the audience's faces and called it the future. The ship's props may have been nothing but hollow plastic tubes, but the series creator's own conservatism regarding his actors' physical appearances was anything but empty. 6. Captain Picard's bald disguise. Pan the camera to the late 1980s, as the production machine began to rumble to life for the Next Generation. Gene Roddenberry clung to an ironclad prejudice about the future, in his utopian vision of the 24th century. Humanity had evolved to absolute perfection, and in that perfection, there was absolutely no room for a bald captain. Enter Patrick Stewart, a seasoned Shakespearean stage actor from London, possessing a commanding, authoritative voice, a piercing gaze, and a completely bald head. Roddenberry loathed the idea from the very first glance to prove his conservative point. The audition process required Stewart to undergo a bizarre compromise. They demanded a wig, not some cheap prop. Stewart had to order a premium, custom-made hairpiece, crafted by one of London's finest theatrical wigmakers and flown express to Los Angeles. He had to wear that expensive disguise, sweating profusely under the blistering studio lights, just to read a few lines of dialogue for the final evaluation round. The charade only ended when the audition tape landed on the desk of Paramount Television's president, John Pike. The network boss glanced at the monitor and swatted away Roddenberry's rigid stubbornness with a dry, definitive verdict. Get the English guy, but lose the wig. In that exact moment, Jean-Luc Picard was officially born. The father of the franchise obsessed over achieving flawless physical appearances on audition tapes. Meanwhile, in another scene entirely, the actors were figuring out how to destroy every single safe reel of tape to forge history with their own hands. 7. The historic take and the sabotaged tapes. The year is 1968. America is boiling over in a wave of civil rights unrest and deep-rooted polarization. 4 months before the episode aired, the nation was shaken by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis. Major cities were burning, and right in the eye of that political storm, the script for Plato's Stepchildren demanded that Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura share a kiss. The heads of NBC froze in terror. They weren't worried about morality or art. They were worried about revenue. Local television affiliates in the American South controlled the broadcast signals in their territories, and if even one of them decided to pull the plug on the program, advertisers would pull their money with it. The equation was simple. One kiss could vaporize millions of dollars in advertising contracts. The network ordered the director to shoot 2 versions, one actual kiss, and a safe version where the 2 actors merely turned their heads at an angle, their lips never making contact. Shatner and Nichols understood this corporate manipulation all too well. They knew that if a safe take existed in the editing room, the network would inevitably use it, not because it was visually superior, but because it wouldn't cause trouble. An unspoken pact was forged right there on the soundstage. No words were necessary. Every single time the director yelled, "Action," for the backup take, the duo began to sabotage it. They crossed their eyes, they stumbled over their lines, they jerked their heads away from the camera. They pulled ridiculous, exaggerated grimaces the exact second their lips were about to touch. Shatner even purposely rolled his eyes into the back of his head on several takes to ensure not a single frame was usable. Through a flawless, coordinated effort, they systematically destroyed every inch of film meant for the safe version. In reality, they kissed in every single take, even the ones designated as the no-kiss backup. When the footage arrived in the editing bay, the producers realized they were completely out of options. History was forced to happen, because two actors refused to let it go any other way. They shattered racial barriers through sly, silent defiance, simultaneously. The fan community was busy constructing a linguistic barrier of its own, with a fanaticism that defied any script. 8. The fanaticism called Klingon. Listen closely to the Klingon dialogue echoing across screens in the 60s. That harsh, abrasive, guttural noise grinding from the back of the throat was initially just a series of meaningless growls squeezed out by actors on set. There were no grammatical rules, no consistent vocabulary. From one episode to the next, the exact same word could mean completely different things depending on what the actor felt like roaring that day. It wasn't a language, it was orchestrated noise designed to sound intimidating. But the fans refused to accept the meaningless. As the Star Trek cinematic universe bled into the 80s, producers hired linguist Mark Okrand to solve a simple problem the actors in Star Trek III needed to converse in Klingon for extended scenes. And improvised grunting wasn't going to cut it anymore. Okrand sat down and did what no one had asked him to do. Quite so thoroughly, he built a complete phonetic system, a strict set of grammatical rules, and an expandable vocabulary lexicon. He treated the fictional tongue as if it were a living, breathing language. The results spiraled beyond his wildest calculations. For nearly a decade, this language quietly infected early internet forums and sci-fi conventions. Klingon was no longer a cinematic prop. It mutated into a real-world living language. By 1992, the Klingon Language Institute was officially founded, and it still exists today with thousands of registered members. The official dictionary was published and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. People organized language courses, certification exams, and academic conferences, all conducted in a tongue that doesn't even belong to Earth. The obsession went so deep that the most fanatic minds sat down and painstakingly translated Shakespeare's Hamlet and even the Bible into Klingon. Not as a joke, but because they truly believed that a real language must have the capacity to carry humanity's greatest texts. They draped an academic legitimacy over an imaginary culture that many actual, living human languages have never possessed. Fans drowned themselves in the fictional world so deeply they rebuilt the very foundations of communication. Yet, the father of real-world communication tech was struggling to extinguish a rumor he himself had accidentally planted. 9. The sci-fi myth and the mobile phone. In the 90s and early 2000s, when the first flip phones emerged and snapped shut with a crisp clack, the media immediately lost its mind. Their silhouette, a flat body, a vertically flipping lid, a short antenna jutting out from the top corner, looked exactly like a miniature replica of the communicator Kirk used to slap into his palm before hailing the Enterprise. Motorola even named one of their models the StarTAC. No one even bothered pretending it was a coincidence. The media unanimously declared Captain Kirk's communication device was the direct inspiration that led humanity to invent the mobile phone. A technological myth was born. Everyone loved it, except for one man, Martin Cooper. the Motorola engineer who actually stood on 6th Avenue in New York on April 3, 1973, and made the first mobile phone call in history. The truth was, Cooper had accidentally dug his own grave with the press in a 2005 comedic documentary hosted by William Shatner, when bombarded with questions about the Star Trek inspiration. He smiled and nodded along, just for fun. It was the kind of polite, throwaway answer a person gives when they don't want to ruin the vibe, a harmless joke. But the media machine doesn't understand jokes. That clip was extracted, went viral, and within a few years, the Star Trek narrative morphed into a fact confirmed by the creator himself, appearing on Wikipedia, in textbooks, and across thousands of articles. Cooper had to live with that shadow for 2 decades. His true inspiration didn't come from glamorous deep space voyages. It came from the two-way wrist radio worn by Detective Dick Tracy in the crime comic books he obsessively read in the 1930s, back when he was just a boy in Chicago, oblivious to the fact that he would grow up to build that exact technology in the real world. Cooper bluntly corrected the record in his 2021 memoir with sheer exhaustion. "I keep saying, it wasn't Star Trek, it was Dick Tracy, but nobody listens. The masses always prefer an intoxicating narrative over the unvarnished truth. And sometimes, even the most brilliant creative minds are coldly rejected by the gatekeepers of the industry." 10. The Game of Thrones. Author kicked out of the interview room. Hollywood is a meat grinder of definitions. Long before the name George R.R. Martin became the absolute guarantee for global television viewership records with Game of Thrones, he was just a middle-aged screenwriter trying to find his footing in television after years of writing sci-fi novels and working on the reboot of The Twilight Zone. In the mid-'80s, when the next generation was aggressively recruiting its writing staff, Martin walked into the network's office and sat down in the interview chair. He brought a formidable resume, Hugo Awards, Nebula Awards, and a string of critically acclaimed short stories. With the mindset of a man who had written serious science fiction for a decade, he introduced himself in the most natural way possible. "I am a science fiction writer." That single title alone ignited immediate hostility on the other side of the desk. The executive producer, whom Martin later described as a man who, fortunately, didn't last long on the show, and you'll understand why when you hear this story, immediately threw cold water on him. He definitively declared that Star Trek wasn't science fiction. It was a show about people, about relationships, about philosophy. Science fiction was merely the backdrop. A science fiction writer simply wouldn't be able to grasp that. Martin walked out of that building empty-handed, years later. When A Song of Ice and Fire had sold tens of millions of copies and Game of Thrones became the most-watched television series on the planet, he recalled that afternoon with a smirk. "I was fooled by all the photon torpedoes and starships." That executive producer, likely Maurice Hurley, the showrunner during the chaotic first 2 seasons before being replaced, left no memorable mark on television history. The man he pushed out the door, however, did. A novelist was ruthlessly dismissed, all because of a network's narrow-minded definitions. Meanwhile, for the character of Uhura, she almost voluntarily abandoned her historic role until a real-life giant stepped forward to block her path. 11. Martin Luther King Jr.'s request. After the first season wrapped, the pressure began to crush her. Nichelle Nichols was exhausted. She decided to abandon her future on broadcast television and retreat to the safe, familiar lights of the Broadway stage. A resignation letter was placed squarely on Gene Roddenberry's desk. It wasn't because she didn't love the role. The rot was somewhere else entirely. The character of Uhura was still there. But every single week, she was increasingly marginalized in the script, a black woman relegated to sitting behind a console, permitted to spout a few robotic lines of technical jargon before fading into the background. Network executives had quietly been slicing away scenes that rightfully belonged to her. The producers brushed it off as editorial decisions. Nichols understood exactly what the real message was. But the morning after handing in her resignation, she called to retract it, all because of an unannounced, fateful encounter at a civil rights organization event in Los Angeles. Nichols unexpectedly crossed paths with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He approached her, introduced himself as her biggest fan, and flatly rejected her intention to quit. He saw straight through what the television executives of that era desperately tried to ignore. The presence of Uhura wasn't just an entertaining role, it was a living, breathing symbol of equality broadcasting into millions of American homes every week, right in the dead center of a deeply fractured society. He pointed out that in the entire history of television, a black woman had never been allowed to sit in a position like that, not as a waitress, not as a maid, but as a commanding officer on a starship conquering the cosmos. Nichols later recounted that he imparted to her a concept bearing immense historical weight. For the first time, the world sees us as we should be seen as equals. The vision of a social activist anchored one individual to the screen. At the very same time, humanity's greatest minds were hungering to cross into this fictional world at any cost. 12. Stephen Hawking's scene of a lifetime in the vast, sprawling history of this franchise. Only one person was ever granted the privilege of playing themselves. Not a politician, not an astronaut, not a single A-list Hollywood star. The 1993 episode, Descent. The holodeck doors slide open. Physicist Stephen Hawking is sitting at a poker table, flanked by the greatest minds to ever exist, Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, and the android Data. In that historically iconic hand of poker, Newton is relentlessly, mockingly bullied by the other two geniuses. Einstein fumbles with the simplest betting calculations. And Hawking, using his own synthesized electronic voice, casually throws razor-sharp jokes about quantum physics right into Newton's face jokes the inventor of classical mechanics couldn't possibly comprehend. It was the first time in television history that a living scientist was scripted into the exact same frame as deceased legends, and he smirked as he raked in the chips. But the thing that left the production crew in stunned silence wasn't in the script. When Hawking visited the set for the first time, this transcendent intellect's first request wasn't to meet the actors or inspect the intricate camera rigs. He asked to be lifted up and placed into the captain's chair of the Enterprise. He sat there, silently staring off into the infinite screen. A humble, profound yearning from a man who had spent his entire life decoding the universe. Hawking could only voyage through his mind and the camera's lens. But for the crew of the Enterprise, stepping onto the screen was sometimes a literal death sentence, following a paradox that managed to fool us all. 13. The fatal paradox of the red shirts. Anyone who ever tuned into the original series knew the unwritten law by heart if you were a nameless background character, and you wore a red uniform. You weren't going to survive past the commercial break. The term red shirt was born from this exact phenomenon, referring to the disposable pawns who showed up solely to die and add stakes to the script. An unfamiliar face and a pair of red boots step off the transporter pad with Kirk's landing party, and the entire living room already knew their fate. The audience was dead set in their belief a red shirt was a premonition of death. But the actual statistical data throws a bucket of ice water onto this myth. It is true that red shirts died the most in absolute numbers because they made up nearly 60% of the entire crew, composing the bulk of the security and engineering departments. But when you place the casualty rates of each uniform color on the scale, a morbid paradox reveals itself. The command division wearing gold shirts, the ones sitting right next to Kirk on the bridge, actually possessed the highest fatality rate. Roughly 18% of the gold-shirted personnel never made it back to the ship, compared to only 10% of the red shirts. Red shirts lost more bodies in total. But putting on a gold shirt and sitting beside Kirk meant the mathematical probability of meeting a violent. tragic end on an alien world was higher than anyone else's. For over half a century, the audience had placed their fear in the wrong color. Who was wiped from the screen first was merely a matter of statistics arranged on a page. But out in the real world, hundreds of thousands of fans decided they weren't going to wait around. They took matters into their own hands, flooding the White House with letters to force history to change. 14. The space machine named Enterprise. Washington, D.C., the summer of 1976. America was gearing up to celebrate its bicentennial. In the quiet, red-carpeted conference rooms, government officials and NASA executives had unanimously agreed to name the first space shuttle Constitution, a name steeped in politics, safe, standard, and utterly immune to controversy. But they had drastically underestimated a new, rising superpower, the science fiction fandom. The audiences who grew up with the show didn't give a damn about political anniversaries. They only cared about their ship. An unprecedented letter-writing campaign was launched from bedrooms and basements all across America. Sacks of mail poured into the mailrooms of Washington like an avalanche, routed straight to the president's desk. Hundreds of thousands of letters bearing one unified, singular demand: rename the ship Enterprise. White House advisors split into two factions. One side saw this as the cheapest, greatest PR opportunity in NASA's history. The other feared the precedent if an entertainment program could warp the decision of the National Space Agency. Where would the line be drawn? Ultimately, the crushing weight of public pressure broke them both. President Gerald Ford personally stepped up to concede. Sweeping the name Constitution aside with a candid admission to the press, "I'm rather partial to the name Enterprise." The Space Shuttle Enterprise rolled out of its hangar to the roaring cheers of the original cast. The show's iconic theme song blared over the launch pad. Gene Roddenberry and Nimoy stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the prototype emerge. However, history always carries a cruel sense of irony. The Shuttle Enterprise was nothing more than a test prototype. It had no engines, it had no thermal protection system, and it never once left the Earth's atmosphere. The name of the imaginary vessel that conquered the cosmos was welded onto a machine that would never be allowed to reach the stars. The furthest, most silent voyage taken by the architects of this dream would only happen long after their hearts had stopped beating. 15. Returning to the stars. Death is usually the final punctuation mark of any script, but for the crew of the Enterprise, it was merely the launch pad for their truest voyage. In 1992, a portion of Gene Roddenberry's ashes was loaded onto the Space Shuttle Columbia, orbiting the Earth before returning home. It was the very first time in human history that a person's remains were launched into space by private request. A few years later, another portion was sent up, a brief, fleeting journey to honor the architect of a fictional universe. But Earth's orbit was still far too close for the souls who hungered for deep space. Cut to the year 2024. A private mission dubbed the Enterprise flight was locked onto the launch pad. This time, the payload capsule didn't just hold Roddenberry's ashes. Accompanying him were the remains of his wife, Majel Barrett, who played more roles in the franchise than any other actor and served as the voice of the Enterprise computer for decades. Accompanying him was James Doohan, the man who, for 30 years, appeared at every single NASA event to inspire the next generation of young engineers. Accompanying him was Nichelle Nichols, the woman a civil rights icon had to personally convince to stay on screen. This launch vehicle didn't come back. It shattered the grip of Earth's gravity and plunged straight into deep space, no destination. No scheduled return, no cheap aluminum powder visual effects, no network suits threatening to slash the budget. No censorship mandates could possibly reach them where they were going. For the first time, their physical remains were truly drifting among the stars, living out the exact iconic phrase that had defined an entire generation: to boldly go where no man has gone before. The eternal, crushing silence beyond the solar system finally closed the loop on a project that was gutted of funding, ruthlessly censored, and brutally rejected, but in the end, actually touched the stars. Outro. Decades have slipped away. The VHS tapes sitting in your glass cabinets might be coated in dust. The heavy CRT televisions that buzzed with static have long vanished from living rooms. But the legacy, the silent rebellions, and the physical sacrifices made behind the lens are still drifting somewhere out there, far beyond the borders of our solar system. Which of these dark truths had you never heard before? Leave a comment down below.